Welcome to another episode of Infographic Instant. In this episode, we'll be looking at the effect of customs bribery on economic growth. Bribes probably hurt economic growth through the sales channel. In other words, as traders pay bribes to customs officials, those bribes in turn reduce demand for goods and services, and they also reduce the resources that companies have in order to produce goods and services. So bribes lead to decreased sales and thus revenue, and of course decreased revenue leads to lower GDP, GDP being both production and consumption. So with this model in mind, let's turn to the infographic we see in front of us. The infographic shows estimates of bribes paid by businesses as expressed as a percent of sales. And we see a large variation in the amount of bribes paid, ranging all the way from 10, 15, perhaps even 20% in countries like Estonia, in countries like Hungary, to a lesser extent Azerbaijan, to relatively low levels of potential bribe taxes in Turkey, Poland, and Albania. Now, these they're called bribe taxes because bribes in fact act like a tax. You may have heard on the television or the radio how taxation is bad for the economy, and it's bad for the economy because, again, it reduces the amount of money that consumers have, and it reduces the amount of money that producers have. So that's why we often say that taxes create a wedge, a triangular wedge, which multiply depending on the amount of taxation. So as taxes go from 2 to 4%, the damage they do to the economy actually increases by a quadratic amount from 4% to 16%. And it's that quadratic harm which makes both taxes and bribes potentially harmful. However, unlike in the case of taxation, bribery has much less of a public good feature. We pay taxes in order to get public services, but usually bribes simply redistribute income instead of produce useful goods and services that are important for the economy. There's another impact of bribery which is much less talked about in the literature, and that is the effect on labor and capital through something economists know as the Stolper-Samuelson effect. Now, this is a bit of academic arcana, but it basically tells that when you tax something, when things are traded and you create a tax, it's going to affect one factor of production more than the other factor of production, depending on what that country is good at, which factors of production that country has more of. So labor-intensive economies like the Ukraine, Bangladesh, India tend to have larger impacts on labor for these trade taxes, whereas in capital-intensive goods like Germany, the US, Japan, taxes tend to affect capital more vigorously than labor. So anytime you see a bribe tax like this being imposed by customs officials or other officials in an economy, we know that it's going to distort international trade just as much as it's going to distort the domestic economy. So with that, we end another episode of Infographic Instant. This has been Brian Michael. Thank you for listening.